See? It's gonna ignite that hay. He'll burn alive in that thing.
26 degrees below zero outside, 48 degrees inside. No fire burning. This impossible equation kept Samuel Thornton alive through the winter of 1874, while his neighbors burned furniture to stay warm, and two men froze to death in their beds just miles away. The ranchers along Wyoming's Wind River Basin had called him a fool 6 months earlier when he started building what looked like a fortress of hay around his cabin. They said he'd burn to death when sparks hit the dried grass. They said he'd suffocate from lack of air. They said he was wasting good livestock feed on madness. But on that January morning, when the thermometer hit 26 below, and Samuel woke in his shirt sleeves to a cabin that held its heat like a miracle, those same ranchers stopped laughing. They started asking questions.
How did you survive this cold?
You're warm, with no fire?
Samuel Thornton had come to the Wind River country 3 years earlier, in 1870, trailing cattle north from Colorado with nothing but determination and a small inheritance from his father's estate back in Pennsylvania. He was 32 years old that autumn, lean and weathered, with the kind of steady hands that came from years of working wood and stone. He served briefly in the final year of the war, seen enough of Virginia mud and Georgia heat to last a lifetime, then drifted west like so many others seeking land and independence. The 160 acres he'd claimed sat in a broad valley between the Wind River Range to the west and the Owl Creek Mountains to the north. Good grazing land with a creek that ran clear even in August, but exposed to winds that came howling down from the high country with nothing to slow them but distance and determination. The cabin he'd built that spring measured 16 feet by 24 feet, constructed from lodgepole pine logs he'd hauled down from the foothills and notched together with careful precision. The walls stood 7 feet high at the eaves, chinked with clay mixed from the creek bank and dried grass. He'd cut the roof poles himself, laid them at a steep pitch to shed snow, then covered them with split shakes and a layer of sod for insulation. It was solid work, the kind of cabin that would last decades if maintained properly. But Samuel knew from his first 2 winters in a dugout shelter that solid logs alone wouldn't keep a man comfortable when the thermometer dropped to 30 below and the wind came screaming across the basin like a living thing made of ice and fury. The conventional wisdom was simple and unquestioned. You built thick walls, chinked them tight, kept a fire burning in your stove day and night, and endured. You burned cord after cord of wood, rising every few hours through the winter nights to feed the flames, living in a cycle of heat and cold that left you exhausted by spring. Men froze to death in their sleep when fires went out. Families huddled together under buffalo robes and still woke to ice on the inside walls. Cattle died by the hundreds in severe winters, frozen where they stood in the fields. This was the price of living in the high country, and every rancher, every settler, every trapper who called Wyoming home accepted it as an unchangeable fact. But Samuel Thornton had spent the previous winter reading every book on building and shelter he could acquire from the trading post at South Pass City, 60 miles to the southwest. He'd studied descriptions of sod houses used by Norwegian settlers in Minnesota, learned about the insulating properties of dead air space from a treatise on architecture written by a Boston engineer, and observed how snow itself protected ground beneath it from the deepest cold. Somewhere in all that accumulated knowledge, an idea had taken root. What if the cabin itself wasn't the only line of defense? What if you could create a buffer, a dead space between the living quarters and the killing wind, using the most abundant resource available on a cattle ranch? The hay he'd put up that summer totaled nearly 40 tons, far more than his small herd of 60 cattle would need to survive until spring grass. He could spare some for an experiment. He could spare quite a lot, actually, if the experiment worked the way he calculated it might. The mockery started in early September when he began the work. His nearest neighbor, a grizzled Scotsman named Douglas Mackay, who ran 300 head on the benchland to the east, rode over specifically to ask what in blazes Samuel thought he was accomplishing. Samuel explained his theory about insulation and thermal mass and dead air space, and Mackay had listened with the kind of patience you'd show a simple child before informing him that hay was flammable, that it would draw mice and rats by the thousands, that moisture would rot it to useless compost by spring, and that he was wasting both material and effort on foolishness when he should be cutting firewood for the long cold ahead. When Samuel thanked him for the concern and went back to work, McKay rode off muttering about educated fools being the most dangerous kind. But Samuel Thornton was many things, and stubbornly ranked high among them. He'd calculated what he needed, and he meant to see it through. As September gave way to October, and the aspen leaves turned gold in the high country, he worked alone, building his barrier of hay against the coming cold. The neighbors who passed by stopped calling it an experiment. They started calling it Thornton's folly. Some predicted he'd burn to death when a spark from his chimney ignited the hay. Others said he'd suffocate from lack of air circulation. A few suggested the weight would collapse his cabin walls. None thought he'd survive until spring with his sanity intact. But winter had other plans. And those plans would teach the Wind River Basin a lesson about survival that would spread across Wyoming territory and beyond, saving lives and livestock for generations to come. Samuel's design was more sophisticated than it appeared to the casual observer riding past on the wagon road. He didn't simply stack hay bales against his cabin walls in a haphazard pile. Instead, he created a carefully engineered system that would leverage the insulating properties of dried grass while avoiding the dangers his neighbors predicted. He began by driving stakes into the ground exactly 6 feet out from each wall of the cabin, creating a perimeter that left substantial space between the hay and his living quarters. The stakes were cut from green willow, driven 2 feet deep into the earth, and rising 5 feet above ground level. He spaced them every 4 feet around the entire cabin perimeter, creating a framework that would hold the hay bales in place and prevent them from settling against the cabin walls where moisture and fire risk would become genuine concerns. The hay bales themselves were compact blocks of native prairie grass he'd cut and baled in late July when the stems were fully mature and dried by weeks of summer sun. Each bale measured roughly 18 inches by 14 inches by 36 inches long and weighed between 60 and 80 pounds depending on how tightly it had been compressed and tied with twisted wire. He'd learned the baling technique from a German settler passing through 2 summers earlier, and it had proven far superior to the loose haystacks most ranchers still relied upon. The compressed bales shed water better, resisted rot longer, and could be handled and stacked with precision impossible with loose hay. For Samuel's purposes, they were perfect building blocks. He started at the northeast corner, where the winter winds would hit hardest when they came roaring down from the mountains. He laid the first course of bales horizontally, placing them end to end between the willow stakes and the cabin wall, creating a continuous barrier 2 bales high. This first layer stood roughly 30 inches tall and 6 feet away from the cabin logs. The space between, a full 6 feet of open air, was the critical element most observers failed to understand. This wasn't solid insulation pressed against the walls. This was a buffer zone, a dead air space that would trap heat radiating from the cabin while preventing direct contact between the moist interior air and the cold hay exterior. The principle was the same one that made double-pane windows superior to single panes, though few people in Wyoming territory in 1873 had ever seen such a thing. The second course went on with each bale overlapping the joints below, exactly like laying bricks. Samuel had learned masonry basics from his father, who'd built half the stone houses in their Pennsylvania county, and he applied those same principles to his hay wall. Staggered joints meant structural integrity. It meant the whole wall would act as a single unit rather than columns of bales that might settle unevenly or collapse. He worked steadily through September, moving around the cabin 1 course at a time, keeping everything level and plumb using a string line and a carpenter's level he'd packed all the way from Pennsylvania. When curious ranchers stopped to watch, they saw a man treating hay bales like precision masonry, and it only reinforced their belief that Samuel Thornton had lost his grip on practical reality. By the time he reached the 4th course, the hay wall stood roughly 10 feet out from the cabin and over 5 feet high, level with the bottom of his cabin windows. Here Samuel made another modification that puzzled observers. Instead of continuing straight up to the wall in the windows completely, he angled the bales inward, creating a sloped surface that would meet the cabin wall just below the roof line. This slope served multiple purposes. It would shed snow and rain away from the structure, preventing moisture accumulation. It would deflect wind up and over rather than allowing it to hammer directly against the cabin walls. And it reduced the amount of hay needed for the upper courses while maintaining the insulating dead air space where it mattered most, at the level where people lived and cold air naturally settled. The angled section required careful calculation. Samuel used a pitch of approximately 40 degrees, which meant each course stepped inward about 8 inches as it rose. He continued this pattern until the hay wall met the cabin logs just 18 inches below his roof line. The very top course he placed vertically on edge rather than horizontally, creating a crown that followed the contour of his cabin's profile. This final detail served both practical and aesthetic purposes. It prevented rain from running down behind the hay, and frankly, it looked intentional rather than haphazard. If people were going to call it Thornton's folly, at least it would be a well-built folly. The entire process consumed 3 weeks of hard labor and roughly 12 tons of hay. The finished structure created an insulated envelope around his cabin that left only the door exposed on the south wall, where he'd cut a tunnel-like passage through the hay barrier. This tunnel measured 6 feet long, just wide enough for a man to walk through comfortably, with bales stacked overhead to form a crude arch. It reminded Samuel of the covered passages he'd seen in illustrations of medieval castles, and he found something deeply satisfying about that comparison. The frontier might lack stone fortifications, but a man could build himself a fortress against winter using nothing but dried grass and determination. What Samuel understood, and what his critics failed to grasp, was the science of heat loss. A cabin heated by a wood stove loses warmth through 3 primary mechanisms: conduction through the walls and roof, air infiltration through gaps and cracks, and radiation directly to the cold outside air. Most frontier cabins fought a losing battle against all 3. The logs conducted heat outward to the frigid air. Wind forced its way through imperfect chinking, creating drafts that made fires flicker and people shiver. And the heat that did accumulate radiated away into the vast cold night. Men compensated by burning massive amounts of wood, but it was an exhausting equilibrium that barely kept the interior temperature above freezing on the coldest nights. Samuel's hay barrier attacked all 3 mechanisms simultaneously. The 6-foot air gap between cabin and hay created what engineers call a thermal buffer zone. Heat radiating from the cabin logs warmed this trapped air, and warm air, being less dense than cold air, naturally rose toward the roof where the hay overhang held it in place. This created a stable envelope of air that remained significantly warmer than the outside temperature even without any additional heat source. The hay itself, with its hollow stems and dense packing, provided substantial insulation against conduction, preventing the cold from penetrating inward to reach that precious buffer zone. And the sheer mass of the structure, 12 tons of compressed grass, acted as thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, moderating temperature swings. But the real genius was what happened with air infiltration. The tunnel entrance on the south side created what's known as an airlock effect. Cold air entering through the door had to travel 6 feet through an enclosed passage before reaching the cabin proper. In that passage, the air warmed slightly from contact with the hay and from mixing with warmer air radiating from the cabin. More importantly, the tunnel configuration prevented wind from driving directly into the living space. Wind hitting the hay wall was deflected up and over, creating a zone of relatively calm air around the cabin. Anyone who's ever tried to light a lamp in a Wyoming wind knows the difference between still air and moving air. That difference, multiplied across an entire winter, translated to comfort and survival. Samuel completed his hay fortress in the final week of October. The timing proved fortunate because the first snow arrived on November 2nd, earlier than usual, carrying on winds that howled down from the mountains with temperatures dropping to 15 degrees above zero. It wasn't a major storm by Wyoming standards, just 6 inches of powder, but it was cold enough to require fires in every cabin and dugout across the basin. Samuel lit his stove that evening more out of habit than necessity, using seasoned pine logs he'd split and stacked inside his tunnel passage where they'd stay dry all winter. He fed the fire modestly, maintaining a small flame rather than the roaring blaze most settlers relied upon. By midnight, with the storm still driving snow against his walls, Samuel made an observation that both surprised and delighted him. The cabin interior registered 62 degrees on the thermometer he'd hung from a roof beam, and he'd been letting the fire die down for over an hour. The stove was barely warm to the touch, In his dugout the previous winter, the temperature would have been below 40 by now even with a fire still burning. He added one more log, more from curiosity than need, and lay down on his bunk to sleep. When he woke at dawn, the fire had burned to ashes, but the cabin still held at 58 degrees. Outside, according to the thermometer he'd mounted on a stake beyond his hay wall, the temperature had dropped to 8 above zero. The hay barrier was working better than even his most optimistic calculations had predicted, but that first snow was merely a warning shot. November passed with typical weather for the high country, cold nights down to 0 or below, days that sometimes warmed to 20 or 30 degrees. Samuel burned less than a third of the wood he'd used the previous November, and his cabin stayed consistently comfortable. He could walk around in his shirt sleeves while neighbors bundled in wool and buffalo hide. He slept through entire nights without waking to feed his fire. The mice his neighbors predicted never materialized in significant numbers, probably because the cold-loving rodents found the warm buffer zone uncomfortable and the tightly packed bales difficult to burrow through. The hay showed no signs of rot or moisture damage, and there were no fires despite regular chimney use. Word began to spread, carried by cowboys moving between ranches and traders making their winter rounds. Some dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Others remained skeptical but curious. Douglas McKay rode over in mid-November, and Samuel invited him inside for coffee. McKay stood in the cabin, feeling the warmth, noting the small fire in the stove, and said nothing for a long minute. Finally, he asked how much wood Samuel was burning. When Samuel estimated he'd used perhaps a quarter cord since the snow fell, McKay shook his head slowly. He'd already burned 3 cords himself, and it wasn't even Thanksgiving. The Scotsman left without admitting he'd been wrong, but he stopped calling it Thornton's folly. He started calling it Thornton's experiment, which for a man like Douglas McKay was as close to an apology as you'd likely get. December arrived with heavier snow and colder temperatures. The Wind River Basin, sitting at roughly 5,000 feet elevation and surrounded by mountains that rose to over 13,000 feet, was no place for the timid when winter truly set in. Ranchers accepted livestock losses as inevitable. Every man knew that a severe winter could wipe you out financially, reducing 3 years of hard work to frozen carcasses scattered across the range. You built shelters for your horses, your milk cows, your breeding stock. The rest you turned loose and hoped they'd survive in the coulees and cottonwood bottoms where wind wouldn't hit them quite so hard. Some did. Many didn't. That was ranching in Wyoming territory. Samuel had built a lean-to shelter for his 2 horses and single milk cow against the east side of his hay-wrapped cabin, extending his thermal buffer to protect his essential livestock. The lean-to shared the warmth radiating from the hay wall and provided basic protection from wind and snow. It wasn't heated beyond what the animal's own body heat contributed, but in combination with the hay wall, it proved remarkably effective. His neighbors who visited remarked that his cow was still producing milk well into December when most dairy cattle had either dried up from stress or been slaughtered because keeping them alive through winter cost more than they produced. Samuel's cow stood contentedly in her shelter, warm enough to maintain production, protected by tons of dried grass and simple physics. The real test came in January. Weather across the West that winter of 1874 was notably severe, though it wouldn't earn a place in the record books like the terrible winter of 1886 would do a dozen years later. But for the ranchers and settlers of Wind River Basin, January 1874 brought conditions harsh enough to test every assumption about survival. The month started cold and grew colder. A high-pressure system settled over Wyoming like a frozen dome, trapping Arctic air that pushed temperatures down and kept them down for days at a stretch. When the wind blew, which was often, the cold became something beyond mere discomfort. It became a physical threat, a presence that could kill an unprepared man in minutes and a prepared man in hours. On January 14th, a Tuesday that Samuel would remember for the rest of his life, the temperature dropped to 26 degrees below zero by his thermometer reading at dawn. No wind, just still, crystalline cold that made the air itself seem fragile, like it might shatter if you moved too quickly. Smoke from his chimney rose perfectly vertical in the dead calm, a white column against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Samuel had let his fire go out during the night, an experiment he'd been wanting to try. When he woke, the cabin interior registered 48 degrees. Outside, 26 below. A difference of 74 degrees maintained by nothing but hay bales and trapped air. He started his morning fire, not because he needed to, but because coffee required heat, and a man starts his day properly with coffee. That same morning, Douglas McKay's youngest son rode over on a half-frozen horse to ask if Samuel had any firewood to spare. Their own supply had run dangerously low. They'd been burning wood at an unsustainable rate trying to keep their cabin habitable, and McKay had underestimated how much would be needed. It was a humbling admission for a proud man to send his son to make, but survival trumped pride. Samuel had plenty to spare. He'd cut and stacked 20 cords back in September, figuring he'd need at least 15 to make it through winter. At his current burn rate, he'd use perhaps 6 cords total. He loaded the McKay boy's horse with as much split pine as the animal could carry and sent him home with directions to return as often as needed. The wood wasn't a gift. They'd settle accounts in the spring with labor or beef or cash, whatever worked. But no man let his neighbor freeze over unpaid debts. The cold held for 6 days. Temperatures ranged from 15 below at the warmest afternoon to 34 below on the coldest night. Across the basin, ranchers burned furniture when firewood ran out. Families moved into their barns to share warmth with livestock. 2 elderly settlers died in their cabins, found frozen days later when neighbors finally managed to check on them through the snow. It was the kind of cold that made men question their decisions, made them wonder if any amount of land was worth enduring this annual trial by ice. And through it all, Samuel Thornton's cabin stayed comfortable on 1 or 2 logs every few hours, warm enough that he could read by lamplight in his shirt sleeves, warm enough that he almost forgot men were dying just miles away. When the cold finally broke on January 20th and temperatures climbed back to an almost balmy 10 above zero, riders began appearing at Samuel's tunnel entrance. They came singly and in pairs, ranchers and settlers who'd heard the stories and now wanted to see for themselves. Samuel welcomed them all, showed them his thermometer readings, explained his design principles, and walked them around the exterior so they could understand the structure. Most listened carefully. Some asked detailed questions about bale placement, air gaps, and tunnel construction. A few remained skeptical, suggesting that his cabin faced south or his valley was particularly sheltered or some other factor explained the results better than hay bales. Samuel didn't argue. The thermometer numbers spoke clearly enough to anyone willing to listen. But the truly remarkable discovery came in late January when Samuel decided to measure the temperature gradient through his hay barrier. Using a long steel rod with a thermometer attached to the end, he drilled a hole through the hay at roughly 4 feet above ground level and took readings at various depths. What he found was striking. At the outer surface of the hay, the temperature matched the ambient air, 12 degrees. 6 inches into the hay, it was 22 degrees. 12 inches in, 31 degrees. At 18 inches, right at the midpoint of his barrier, the temperature held at 42 degrees. And in the air gap between hay and cabin logs, it registered 58 degrees. His cabin interior at the time was 65 degrees with a small fire burning. The temperature gradient was nearly linear, exactly what you'd expect from effective insulation, and it demonstrated that heat was moving outward from cabin to air very slowly, very inefficiently, which in winter was exactly what you wanted. These numbers fascinated a young surveyor named James Mitchell who happened to be wintering at the trading post in South Pass City. Mitchell had studied engineering at a technical college in New York before heading west for his health, and he understood the mathematics of heat transfer better than most. When he heard about Thornton's hay house, he rode 60 miles through February snow to see it himself. Samuel showed him everything, shared all his measurements and observations. Mitchell spent 3 days taking his own readings, calculating heat loss rates, and analyzing the design. When he left, he told Samuel that his hay barrier was providing insulation equivalent to roughly 12 to 15 inches of solid wood, and doing so at a fraction of the weight and cost. Moreover, the air gap was adding another layer of protection that solid insulation couldn't provide. Mitchell estimated that Samuel's total heating requirement had been reduced by approximately 75 to 80% compared to an unprotected cabin of the same size. The surveyor also made a prediction. He said if someone were to quantify the exact temperature difference between a protected and unprotected cabin during a severe cold, you'd likely see the interior of the protected cabin running 20 to 25 degrees warmer under identical heating conditions. Samuel tested this prediction informally in late February during another cold snap. He let his fire burn out completely overnight when the temperature outside dropped to 18 below zero. By morning, his cabin interior had cooled to 41 degrees. At the same time, he walked to Douglas McKay's ranch, 3 miles east, where the Scotsman had maintained a fire through the night. McKay's cabin, of similar construction to Samuel's but without the hay protection, registered 17 degrees inside despite continuous heating. The difference was 24 degrees. Mitchell's prediction had been remarkably accurate. Word of the hay barrier concept spread through Wind River Basin like grass fire through August prairie. By March, before the snow had even melted, ranchers were planning their own versions for the following autumn. Some wanted to replicate Samuel's design exactly. Others proposed modifications, using straw instead of hay, building the barrier in a square rather than following the cabin profile, incorporating south-facing openings to capture solar heat during the day. Samuel shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked. He drew diagrams on scraps of paper, explained the critical importance of the air gap, and emphasized that the hay needed to be well cured and dry before installation. He'd learned hard lessons about what worked and was willing to save others the trouble of learning those same lessons through failure. The following autumn, September of 1874, at least 15 cabins across the basin acquired hay barriers. Some followed Samuel's design closely. Others experimented with variations. A few ignored his advice about the air gap and stacked bales directly against their walls, then spent the winter dealing with moisture problems Samuel had warned about. But most achieved significant improvement in comfort and heating efficiency. Douglas McKay, stubborn Scotsman that he was, built a hay wall around 3 sides of his cabin, leaving the south side open with just a simple windbreak. It worked well enough that he admitted, publicly and in front of witnesses at the trading post, that perhaps young Thornton hadn't been such a fool after all. Coming from McKay, this qualified as high praise. The concept spread beyond the Wind River Basin. Traders carried the story to South Pass City, to the gold camps around Atlantic City and Miners' Delight, to ranches along the Sweetwater River and down toward Rawlins. Newspapers picked up the account. The Cheyenne Daily Leader ran a story in November of 1874 titled, "Rancher's Hay Invention Beats Wyoming Cold," which overstated both Samuel's role as inventor and the barrier's effectiveness, but captured enough truth to inspire more experimentation. Cowboys wintering at line camps started stacking hay around their crude shelters. Sheepherders did the same with their wagons. The technique even reached Montana Territory, where winters were if anything more brutal than Wyoming, and there it found fertile ground among German and Scandinavian settlers who'd already been experimenting with thick-walled sod houses and other insulation strategies. The true measure of impact came during the winter of 1875 and 1876. That winter brought heavier snow and longer cold spells than the previous 2 years, and it arrived early, with severe weather starting in November and lasting through March. Across Wyoming Territory, livestock losses were significant. But in Wind River Basin, where nearly 40 cabins and shelters now sported hay barriers of various designs, human suffering was notably less than in surrounding areas. Families stayed warm on modest amounts of firewood. No one froze to death in the basin that winter, though deaths occurred in less protected settlements nearby. The hay-wrapped structures became known informally as Thornton houses, though Samuel himself never used that term and found the attention somewhat embarrassing. What Samuel had demonstrated was something both simple and profound. Survival on the frontier didn't always require more resources. Sometimes it requires using available resources more intelligently. Hay was abundant on any ranch running cattle or horses. It was renewable annually. It was easy to work with using no tools beyond human hands and simple stakes. And when properly applied, it could reduce heating requirements by 3/4 or more, which translated directly to less time cutting wood, less money spent on supplies, less risk of freezing during cold snaps, and more energy available for the actual work of building a life in a hard country. The hay barrier wasn't complicated engineering. It was practical physics applied with common materials. It was exactly the kind of innovative frontier life rewarded. By then, The hay barrier concept had been largely superseded by better construction techniques, by lumber mills that made dimension timber affordable, by coal that burned hotter and cleaner than wood, and eventually by the kind of insulation materials that would have seemed like fantasy to men of the 1870s. But the lesson remained valid. For a decade or more, across Wyoming and Montana and parts of Colorado and Dakota Territory, men and women used hay and ingenuity to make harsh winters survivable. How many lives were saved by that innovation? The number is impossible to calculate with certainty, but it was not trivial. In a region where winter mortality was an accepted reality, where families sometimes found neighbors frozen in their homes come spring, where children died of cold-related illness at rates that would horrify modern sensibilities, anything that reduced exposure to extreme temperatures saved lives. Conservative estimates by territorial health officials suggested that widespread adoption of improved shelter insulation, including hay barriers, correlated with a measurable reduction in winter mortality rates during the late 1870s and early 1880s. The technique also saved livestock, which in economic terms meant saved livelihoods. A cow worth $20 that survived the winter because of a hay-wrapped lean-to was $20 that could be reinvested in more cattle, better horses, land improvements, or simply food and clothing for a growing family. Multiply that across dozens of ranches over multiple winters, and the economic impact becomes substantial. The frontier operated on thin margins. Small advantages compounded over time into the difference between success and failure, between staying and leaving, between life and death. Samuel Thornton's contribution wasn't scientific discovery in the academic sense. Humans had understood insulation principles for thousands of years. Sod houses, snow shelters, multiple layers of clothing, all relied on the same physics Samuel applied to his cabin. What he did was adapt those principles to specific frontier conditions using locally abundant materials and sharing the knowledge freely rather than hoarding it as proprietary information. In that sense, his real contribution was social as much as technical. He demonstrated that frontier individualism didn't preclude cooperation, that a man could help his neighbors succeed without diminishing his own success, that knowledge shared multiplied in value rather than divided. The hay barrier also represented something larger about frontier innovation. The West was settled not just by tough people willing to endure hardship, but by creative people willing to question assumptions and try new approaches. The conventional wisdom said you built log cabins and burned enormous amounts of wood and accepted brutal discomfort as the price of living in the high country. Samuel questioned that wisdom, ran the experiment, proved the alternative worked, and changed how people thought about winter shelter. That pattern repeated across countless domains: water management, livestock breeding, crop selection, mining techniques, transportation routes. The frontier rewarded practical innovation because survival depended on finding better solutions to persistent problems. By the time Samuel died in 1907 at age 66, the Wyoming he'd known as a young man had largely disappeared. The open range was gone, fenced into private holdings. The great cattle drives had ended. Railroads connected towns that had been weeks apart by wagon. Electric lights were replacing oil lamps in the larger settlements. The brutal frontier conditions that made hay barriers necessary had been moderated by better housing, better heating systems, and better supply networks. Few people remembered Thornton's folly or the winter when one rancher's strange idea changed how a whole territory thought about staying warm. But the story endured in family histories and local legends, in accounts written by children who'd grown up in hay-wrapped cabins and remembered the warmth, in occasional newspaper retrospectives about frontier life and pioneer ingenuity. The Wyoming State Historical Society has references to hay-insulated structures in several collections of territorial-era correspondence and journals. A few photographs from the 1880s show cabins with what appear to be hay barriers, though the image quality makes definitive identification difficult. The technique left traces in the historical record, not as a major invention that changed the world, but as a minor innovation that changed some lives during a specific time and place. And perhaps that's the appropriate legacy. Not every contribution to human welfare has to be revolutionary. Sometimes it's enough to make one hard winter slightly less hard for a few dozen families. Sometimes it's enough to demonstrate that problems have multiple solutions and conventional wisdom isn't always wise. Sometimes it's enough to be the person who tries something different when everyone else says it won't work, proves them wrong, and shares what you learned so others can benefit. Samuel Thornton did that. For a few years in the 1870s, in one basin of Wyoming territory, he changed how people survived winter. The technique faded when better options emerged, but the lives saved and the comfort provided during those transition years were real and valuable. The neighbors stopped laughing that winter of 1874. They stopped calling it folly when their own children shivered under buffalo robes, while Samuel Thornton read by lamplight in his shirt sleeves, cabin warm on a handful of firewood that would have barely lasted them an afternoon. They stopped shaking their heads when their thermometers read 15 degrees inside, while his stayed at 65. And they never forgot what the quiet rancher from Pennsylvania taught them about survival. Not just the specific technique of hay barriers, but the larger lesson that ingenuity matters as much as endurance, that thinking differently can save your life, and that the man everyone calls a fool might just be the man who figures out what everyone else missed. The Wind River Basin learned that lesson wrapped in hay and proven by winter, and the knowledge spread north and south and east across the high plains, carried by cowboys and traders and settlers who understood that survival in hard country required every advantage you could find or invent or borrow from the neighbor who'd figured it out first.